Hey, today we're going to be talking about the evidence supporting evolution. So when we think about the evidence supporting evolution, there are essentially six major lines of evidence which give us evidence that actually backs up evolution as a theory. So what are those six lines of evidence? The first includes actually direct observation of evolution, and we'll go through some examples of those today. The next involves homologous structures, so we can actually compare structures across organisms and kind of infer what they mean evolutionarily. And a number of these actually include vestigial structures, some of which are actually found in humans as well as other organisms. Also, the fossil record that we've already talked a little bit about in our previous lecture. We can also look at a special case of evolution called convergent evolution, where we see similarities arise, but not due to common ancestry, which is a little different example of evolution, which we'll talk about today. Biogeography, essentially where we find different fossil and flora forms throughout the Earth. And then lastly, of course, molecular biology. So there's been a great deal of information that we've been able to glean, looking at evolution, looking at DNA, looking at proteins, looking at biochemistry, using modern techniques. So we'll talk about all of these today with some examples, and a lot of this information will be found in your text, chapters 18, 19, and 20. So our first major line of evidence, or evidence for evolution, includes direct observation of evolutionary change. So biologists have documented evolutionary change in thousands of scientific studies that are peer-reviewed. One of these actually includes none other than the Grant study by Rosemary and Peter Grant on Daphne major and the Galapagos Island change on the medium ground finch. So that's an example of biologists essentially directly observing evolutionary change. And so you remember that that's what the lab is about for Biology 160. Also, a common example when we look at direct observation of evolutionary change also includes the example of the bison or peppered moth. So recall there was a color variant of the peppered moth where we see after the Industrial Revolution a change over time in terms of the color variation that was more common, that stood out, or was well camouflaged, let's say, to its background, increasing in actually in the population. So that's another example of direct observation of evolutionary change. We also see what's going on with modern medicine and actually a lot of bacteria that are becoming more and more resistant to antibiotics. And this is essentially called antibiotic resistance. And this is actually a real potential issue that's going to be emerging in the next several years. That could be a problem in terms of antibiotics losing how effectively they can combat bacterial infection. So that's another example of direct observation of evolutionary change. Similar or along those lines, we also see what occurs with application of pesticides and herbicides that are applied to weeds and also insects. So insects are becoming more and more resilient to the typical kinds of pesticides that are sprayed on crops, and that's also an emerging issue and problem. And then lastly, for our lines of evidence for direct observations of evolutionary change, we see what's occurring with mosquitoes in some areas of the world, particularly Africa comes to mind, that we see DDT losing its ability to actually kill off mosquitoes. So DDT has been used historically in the States, it's now legal, but it's still used in Latin American and also in African countries to actually kill off mosquitoes and mosquito larvae, but it's becoming less effective. So it's an interesting example of direct observations of evolutionary change with those mosquitoes becoming more and more resilient to the application of DDT. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about conservation biology and the question of should we still be using DDT in these areas when it's not as effective. So our second line of evidence for evolution includes homology and more importantly homologous structures. So first let's just talk briefly about what a homology is. A homology can be defined as any similarity resulting from a common ancestry. And really for this line of evidence we focus more on what are called homologous structures. So these are anatomical structures that represent variations on some form of theme that was present in a common ancestor but then adapted to a specific environment. So we'll walk through an example of what it means to have and compare across organisms that share a common ancestry or an evolutionary point in their lineage, and how these structures can help us piece together evolution and provide evidence for it. And different variations of these traits are selected based on the habitat that arises. So one example of homologous structures, we can look at the homologous structures across vertebrates or even across mammals. So if we look at this example here, we're looking at the forelimbs in various different groups of vertebrates, including humans, which are, the forelimb is well adapted for lifting. So if you look at some of these across the way, you can see how some of their bone structures are similar but modified. And that relates to habitat. What are they used for? What is the forelimb used for in various different groups of vertebrates, various different groups of mammal? So in humans, obviously for lifting, and in dogs for walking, the forelimb modified in birds for flying, similar to our bat example on the right there. In whale, the forelimb for swimming. So what these indicate is that these organisms share at some point in the distant past a common ancestor. So it's just another way of looking at homologous structures across vertebrates or even within mammals that provides evidence for a shared ancestry or common ancestor, uh, providing evidence for evolution. So another example of homologies includes this idea or approach of comparative embryology. So we can actually look at anatomical similarities across developing embryos that are vertebrates. So on the bottom here, we have on the left a typical bird example exemplified by the chicken embryo, and then on the bottom right, a human embryo. So we can actually look at some of these anatomical features or traits that are present during development that are lost as adults. So if we look at the detail here in the bottom or the middle, what we find is that all vertebrate embryos at some point in their developmental time frame develop a tail that's posterior to the anus and also pharyngeal pouches. These are also sometimes referred to as gill slits. And so both of these, the tail and the pharyngeal pouches, are indicative of chordates, but they're actually present in the early embryonic stage. And so in the human example there on the right, these eventually develop into parts of the ears and throat, whereas in the example, let's say of fish, those develop into gills. But we see at the early embryonic stages here, as these organisms, as these vertebrates are developing, that they share those two traits. So that's another line of evidence for evolution, sort of a subsample of homologies and homologous structures, comparative embryology. So we can look at our last example of lines of evidence under homologies as vestigial structures. So what vestigial structures actually are remnants of features that at some point served a function in the organism's ancestors but no longer do so now. So what are examples of vestigial structures? Those include the pelvic bone of snakes, and we'll have a video talking about this, as in the ancestors of snakes that they shared an ancestry with lizards. So snakes evolved from lizards over time. There's not a great fossil record, but we do have some examples of this, which we'll talk about later when we talk about reptiles. But the pelvic bone of snakes is an example of a vestigial structure, a structure that no longer serves a purpose in the modern day organism. We'll also talk about fossil whales, and what we look at in terms of whale evolution as whales evolved to be increasingly aquatic. And then we think about modern day whales having remnants of the pelvis and leg bones of their walking ancestors. And that's another example of a vestigial structure in a modern day whale. You could also look at the wings of flightless birds. So there's a lot of examples of birds on various different islands or island continents where we see over time those birds becoming flightless. So that's an example of a vestigial structure, a subcategory of a homology. We also can see in dark environments as caves, we can see salamanders, crayfish, and fish essentially that still have a remnant eye, but essentially are sightless because they live in these dark environments. And lastly, there may even be some have postulated the human appendix, another example of a vestigial structure in humans. And so it's thought that at one point, the human appendix actually was a beneficial place that actually housed a lot of bacteria, but no longer serves that function. So that's still debated, but it's an interesting example looking just at humans in terms of vestigial structure. So another example of a homology. What we can do with homologies is we can think about tree building or tree thinking. So what we can do is when we organize species or we organize evolutionary groups, we can use these homologies to help us build our phylogenetic tree, and they can tell us, or evolutionary trees. These can tell us a lot about different hypotheses that we have about different groups and how they're related. And so you can construct these evolutionary trees or phylogenies, as we'll come to know them in our next series of lectures, using different amounts of data, anatomical data, DNA sequences, but we can actually use these homologies to help us construct and understand how organisms are related evolutionarily. So we'll get into more of that in our next series of lectures. Here's just a very brief example of what a potential evolutionary tree or phylogeny actually looks like. If we look at some of these characteristics across organisms, and we'll get into more detail about this in our next series of lecture. Another line of evidence for evolution, our third line of evidence, includes what's called convergent evolution. So what is convergent evolution versus divergent evolution? So convergent evolution, what we see is that independently, similar phenotypes will evolve in distantly related species due to similar evolutionary pressures, so not due to common ancestry. So if you think about the top right example there, the Arctic fox and the bird there, we see that they both can blend into their environment and are camouflaged, but they don't necessarily share an immediate common ancestry in the distant past. And so that's called convergent evolution, another line of evidence for species evolving in their own environment. So we can look at another example comparing marsupials to modern day mammals in North America. And so this is different. Convergent evolution is essentially different than divergent evolution, or the example we more commonly think of um, when we think of evolution, natural selection. So this is just another line of evidence for evolution. Here's just briefly what we're discussing here for convergent evolution. So if you look on the left there, we see marsupial mammals. On the right, eutherian mammals, and this will sort of make more sense as we introduce mammals as a group later in the semester. But you can see a lot of similarities in terms of appearance of some of these mammals. On the bottom, the sugar glider, a marsupial mammal found in Australia, versus our flying squirrel native to North Carolina. They look very similar, but they do not in fact share a common ancestor. So they essentially adapted to their own environments independently. So it's an important distinction for what we call convergent evolution. Another example of convergent evolution in marsupial versus eutherian mammals, you can see here a number of examples of that. And we'll revisit this idea when we introduce mammals for the first time. I wanted to at least mention convergent evolution because it's actually a line of evidence for evolution. So to wrap up this idea of convergent evolution, as an example, we see there on the left versus the right, thylacine versus a gray wolf. And so this example is a little interesting to talk about because the thylacine tail vertebrate are more robust and stiff compared to, let's say, a coyote, which even though they look very similar, there are some differences. And so on the left there, we see that thylacine, the marsupial, is actually more related to a kangaroo than it is to a, let's say, North American gray wolf. So using this idea of convergent evolution that animals can adapt to their own environments, it's essentially just a sub case or a special case of evolution that it's not due to common ancestry. So we can actually use DNA evidence and other mechanisms to compare and contrast these examples of convergent evolution. So our fourth line of evidence for evolution includes the fossil record. So we've already talked a little bit about what a fossil is and what the lines of evidence are. What are some of our transitional forms of fossils? And so if we look at the fossil record, it essentially documents the pattern of evolution. So it gives us further evidence for evolution, actually direct physical evidence. And so it provides evidence for the extinction of species that we talked about in terms of earlier in the semester for mass extinction events, the origin of new groups when they occur in those fossils that are found, and also changes within groups over time. So we can actually look at transitional fossils to tell the story of the evolution of some of our major groups, which we'll become more familiar with in the semester. And this essentially documents the transitions or transitional fossils that include, one example which we haven't talked about yet, include whales transition from land to sea. But we've had previously talked about Tiktaalik and Archaeopteryx, so I recommend reviewing those two. And now we'll essentially talk a little bit more about the story of whale evolution, because it's a really good example of a transitional fossil, a number of transitional fossils that are found for whales. So when we look at the story of whale evolution, there's a rich level of fossils that we can find that help us understand the story of whales as they evolved from their terrestrial ancestors into aquatic environments. And we can look at a number of different examples in the fossil record that tell the story of whale evolution. If we look at Pakicetus, as we move forward to an increasingly aquatic, other kind of transitionary fossil for whales, Ambulocetus. And we'll look at some details in how some of these fossils actually compare to modern day whales and another activity we'll have throughout the semester. They're a really good example of the fossil record and another transitional fossil, in addition to the other two we've gone over thus far Tiktaalik, and Archaeopteryx. So we focus in on one example of a transitional whale. We can talk about Ambulocetus here, pictured on the top right, or what's called the walking whale. And these are thought to have inhabited ancient estuaries, and this is an interesting fossil example of a whale. And with some of the traits that we see in the story whale evolution occur increasingly the nostrils becoming further back on the skulls, as implemented there in the middle image. So we see actually moving forward to modern day whales and actually what we know is now the blowhole in cetaceans or modern day whales. Another trait we see when we look at the story whale evolution in the fossil record is the reduction in pelvis. And actually, if you look at modern day whales, their vestigial hind limb is an example of vestigial structure that we just went over. And so, kind of an interesting story of transitional fossil forms of whales as they became increasingly aquatic from their terrestrial ancestors. So, another line of evidence for evolution, just a sub example there for whales. And we'll revisit the idea of whale evolution and activity we have for this class. Our fifth line of evidence for evolution includes biogeography. And so we can look at the presence of species based on location and how they develop. Some examples of biogeography that relate to lines of evidence for evolution. We can look at the groups that evolved before Pangea broke up and how they distributed worldwide. So we kind of already provided some evidence for this in our History of Life on Earth lecture when we looked at Pangea. We can also look at groups that developed after the breakup of Pangea, and where we find groups in certain regions. So if you think about Australia, Australia for a long period of time, millions of years, is essentially an isolated large island continent. And so we see a lot of unique mammals that evolved there over time. We'll get into more detail when we go over mammals later in the semester. We can also look at biogeography in terms of species that are separated by mountain ranges, large rivers, or physical barriers. We'll talk more about this when we talk about speciation. But we can look at biogeography where we see certain groups of flora and fauna to help us tell the story of evolution and another line of evidence for evolution. Among our last lines of evidence for evolution includes molecular biology. So we can look at DNA structures, DNA analysis, and using more recent technologies that helps us support and piece together the story of evolution. And so we can use modern day techniques to look at closely related organisms that have similar DNA. We can also look at biochemical structures. We can look at proteins and the rate of mutations to help us infer evolution across closely related groups of hominids. Let's say if we're looking at comparing groups of the story of human evolution across the greater apes in terms of chimps, gorilla, and orangutans. And we can also look at hemoglobin, we can look at protein, we can look at biochemistry structures and how they're similar across vertebrate groups as well as other groups that we'll talk about later in the semester. So another line of evidence for evolution. Now, there are some misconceptions that are commonly encountered when thinking about evolution as a theory, and I've stated them here. And so we'll talk more about these this semester and some activities we have in lab as well. The idea that evolution is just a theory, but we use the term theory in biology and organismal biology in terms of a scientific definition of the theory. Also, that individuals evolve, that's a common misconception of evolution. We'll talk about how that's not the case. Also, that evolution explains the origin of life. We just really seek in this course in terms of biology and science to explain what we can see, and there's a lot that we don't know as of yet, so that's another common misconception of evolution. And also, lastly, here, that organisms evolved with a set purpose, and so they can only work with what they have. And so these are just some common misconceptions of evolution. And we'll kind of talk about these later in the semester as well. So, what is theoretical about Charles Darwin's view of life on planet Earth? And so, we use the term theory defined in science or in organismal biology as supported by a large amount of scientific evidence. That can be anywhere from peer reviewed scientific literature or fossils or any of the lines of evidence that we've just outlined in this lecture. And so, when we think about Darwin's view of life on planet Earth, the theory of evolution by means of natural selection or the process of natural selection, it's an area of study that integrates a lot of different aspects of biology and also can lead to many new research questions. And as we find new fossil evidence, this sort of helps us tell the story of evolution of some of the many different groups of taxa we're going to go through this semester. Okay, so that concludes our 2 series of lectures for evolution and also the lecture on the evidence of lines of evidence for evolution. So I recommend you go through the learning outcomes for the module for evolution for both sets of lectures, parts 1 and 2, and then use some of that information or in the learning outcomes to essentially help you study and piece together the series of lectures so you can get that information down for purposes of the quiz or exam. So I would use that, make note cards, use Quizlet, do a number of different things you can do to essentially review that material. With that, have a great day. Thanks for listening.